Hi, this is Ilka Cassidy with Passive House Accelerator, and thanks for tuning into the special bonus episode of the Passive House podcast recorded at the International Passive House Conference 24 in Innsbruck, Austria. And a big thank you to Source 2050 for their support of the series. In this interview with Professor Dr. Diana Ürge-Vorsatz, we discussed that we are reaching our limits of adaptation to our changing climate and what to do with an infrastructure for a climate that no longer exists. We're also diving into the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy to see if and in what form Passive House is 42, the ultimate answer. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you for the invitation.
I know that you're very busy. You flew in last night and you're going to leave.
To the train. I will not fly in Europe.
Of course. Sorry. You took the train.
No, it was good to talk about this, that we are really trying to avoid flying now when we can.
Yes, that is correct. So you took the train and you're going to take the train out in a little bit. So we're very fortunate to have you to talk to us for a little bit. Can you explain what you do and who you are?
Thank you for the invitation. I already had the privilege a few years ago to talk to the Passive House Accelerator. My name is Diana Ürge-Vorsatz and I'm a professor at the Central European University, which is now in Vienna. And I'm also vice chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The IPCC, in short, this is the climate science body of the United Nations, if we can say that. We are assessing all climate-related science, and we are presenting it to decision makers so that they can navigate the often conflicting or seemingly potentially controversial information out there, and how much do we know about what, so that they can actually take decisions. And our reports are very highly used by not only in general decision makers, but for example, the conferences of the parties. So for example, the first UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, was also catalyzed to some extent by a report. Then the Kyoto Protocol, then the Paris Agreement were all based very much on our findings. Or, for example, the latest Dubai COP, the global stocktake, also based a lot of its findings on our reports.
Great. And you showed a bunch of graphs today and really explained the urgency that we're facing right now. And you talked about the infrastructure that was built for a climate that does no longer exist. That really stuck with me. Can you talk about that?
Yes. If we look at our climate past, over the last 10,000 years, the climate has been very stable. It has not moved out of a 1 degree centigrade range. And just in the last 2-3 decades, we have already kicked the climate out of this very stable range by 1.2 degrees centigrade, and temporarily actually more than 1.5 degrees even. So that means that we are in uncharted territories. We have left the climate that civilization has evolved in and to which our infrastructure was built for. So we see increasingly the impacts. Dams are failing with thousands of fatalities. We see many other areas, the train lines are not able to withstand either sea level rise or floods. And so on. But also our building infrastructure was built for a different climate. For example, passive houses also used to be optimized for heating energy use, minimizing heating energy use, which is still legitimate, but it's very much changing, since in a large part of the world, cooling will become very important, not only because it will consume a lot of energy, but also because with increasing frequency of heat waves, we will have to protect our population. And this is why we need to rethink our infrastructure in general. That, of course, also still keeps heating in mind, but also we need to focus our new buildings and retrofits in ways that minimize air conditioning needs and still provide thermal comfort and protection against especially extreme heat waves as long as possible, since we see that even just under a few degrees centigrade warming, we see that heat waves that used to occur just twice a century are going to occur 80 times a century, which means roughly every summer we'll have this very extreme heat wave. We saw in 2021 the heat wave which went close to 50 degrees centigrade for 3 days in Canada and northwestern United States. That was definitely a case which showed that it's not possible to survive outdoors for or without cooling or without a good thermal protection for longer. So that really shows that we have to prepare for these heat waves, our infrastructure now, because we know that infrastructure takes a long time to build and retrofit.
Yeah, and regarding the cooling, you also talked about the cooling gap in 2050. What did you mean with that?
We see that towards the middle of the second half of the century, quite an important part of the globe will become uninhabitable from the perspective of the combination of temperature and humidity reaching levels that are just unsafe for human survival, because we operate at 36, 37 degrees and we constantly have to get rid of our heat, and beyond a certain temperature and humidity combination, this is no longer possible. So this you cannot survive in quite large areas of the world under a few degrees centigrade warming. Nevertheless, we could solve it by just providing air-conditioned spaces for everyone. But if we look at the economic scenarios, even under the most optimistic growth scenarios, still the majority of, not the majority, but a large share of the population living in tropical areas, especially in Africa, but also Southeast Asia, will not have access, not to air conditioning, but not even to a refrigerator. So that means there is a gigantic cooling gap. And that means that we have to keep the cities cool. We have to minimize urban heat islands. We have to try to provide shelter for these populations that could keep safe thermal conditions even in hotter periods of the day. But unfortunately, this is not only valid for the poor areas of the world. Even in Europe, we still have energy poverty in terms of heating, and we do have even bigger energy poverty for cooling. And this is also not going to be solved very soon, because we see that the inequality is also growing in Europe, and the poor are not necessarily getting so much richer that we would safely be able to claim that they will have adequate access to cooling services by the time these heat waves are coming.
And you do see that the way we build our buildings have a big impact on the climate right now, but it's also going to be one of the big solutions to change that, correct? So, and that, going back to your presentation title, you're saying that Passive House is the 42. And for everyone who doesn't know the Hitchhiker's Guide to Guide Through the Galaxy, can you explain that reference a little bit?
Right, yes. Perhaps our younger listeners are not so aware of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where 42 is the ultimate answer to universe, the galaxy, and everything. And I picked that because it sounds too good to be true, but after 30 years of research in the climate mitigation field, and not only in buildings, but in general, working with climate science, I still see that passive houses, but in general, whole building solutions which really maximize energy efficiency, so minimize energy demand, are the 42 are the solution to so many of the things. And we have a lot of research evidence and And if I would need to identify all of them, that would take much more than this short interview, but just identifying a few, certainly in terms of climate change mitigation, half of all European final energy use is for heating and cooling. Half. Now, not all of that is for building, heating and cooling, but a significant, but more than half of that, half is for this. We practically, at least for heating, we practically don't need or need very little energy if we have really well-built passive house level buildings or retrofits. So we could eliminate most of that. That would help us with not only with reducing our emissions significantly, but also with energy security. We are suffering in Europe for 2 years from the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war, from the sanctions, from insecurity of natural gas supplies. And all of this we could get isolated from if we had already retrofitted our building stock, because we showed in our research that through good buildings in Europe, we could almost fully eliminate all non-EU natural gas imports. But also, if we go on and look at, for example, health benefits, we have in my group, one of my students have done, he's now a professor in Plymouth University, but he has done a fantastic dissertation on the health benefits and productivity benefits, actually, of passive houses. So we showed that if you switch, if you do manage to retrofit and switch everyone to living and working in passive house standard buildings, then in Germany we can save on average 5 sick days per year. That's a very significant productivity benefit. Most people are not aware that actually the best way to protect yourself from outdoor air pollution is actually also a passive house, or just very good ventilation systems, but also that it prevents, it will at least reduces significantly asthma, allergies, and so on, as well as through reducing the air, outdoor air pollution levels indoors. It reduces cardiovascular diseases, which is still a very important risk factor in Europe for diseases and also letalities. So I could go on, but reducing or eliminating energy poverty to social welfare, better infrastructure, better housing prices, better value for our building stock. But the point is that the reason why I said 42, because it just if we had retrofitted, or if we retrofit, and I hope we will, our building stocks that will address so many of our social, economic, and environmental pressures together.
And if passive house, and I think we agree that it is the 42. Why don't we just do it? Why doesn't every building get built to passive house standard and renovated to passive house standard? Where do you think the barriers are?
That's what I've been asking for a few decades now, and I wish I understood more. But I think what we really need to distinguish between new build and retrofit, because for new build is where, for me, it's just not, it just puzzles me, since we have shown so many times that actually there is today no more cost premium. I mean, you can build a passive house, you can build a net zero energy building, first passive house and with renewables, at basically no cost premium as compared to standard buildings that are being built. So it's clearly, I think where I try to advocate passive house, they just don't believe me. It sounds too good to be true. People just don't want to believe if something is too good. But I don't know. I'm sure perhaps our listeners can, who are practicing, they are able to answer that part better. As for the retrofit, it's much more complex, because even if it is cost effective, we know it pays back. But it's the 20 to 30 year potential payback times are a bit too long for most investors. Even if you involve financial intermediaries, it's becoming even more difficult since they take their profits. So that means the total payback time are even longer at the end of the day, or the cost-effective projects even are becoming less. And even for investors, these timeframes are not very attractive, and also that you're talking about many small projects. No bank is interested in that. No climate fund who wants to make a big difference. They don't want to go to 10,000 buildings and negotiate and so on. They want one big thing. They want one big power plant. They want big dam and so on. So it's difficult. But I do believe that it still has a huge future, because if we compare all the other co-benefits and other impact of the passive house-based climate solutions compared to all the other ones, not all the other ones, but the other ones that we may be running for in this emergency situation when the climate when it's warming more than thought, and it might be actually accelerating at levels, according to some scientists, that we have not really recognized in the future. Many governments are rushing for solutions such as looking into solar radiation modification, carbon dioxide removal, and other or carbon capture and storage, and similar technologies. But in the end, if you compare energy efficiencies, especially passive house retrofits, then these are still much cheaper, because these pay back. None of those pay back without a significant carbon price. But if you have a significant carbon price, also passive house investments will pay back much faster. But also, I just believe that if it's a public interest that we need to stop climate change, then this tremendous amount of climate finance, which is already in the financial system today, and tremendous climate flows, tremendous private sector related, offset related investments and so on. I think we just need to make a much stronger effort of channeling much of that first into passive house retrofits. For example, now most of the offsets are tree planting, and so on. We are finding out that these mostly don't work, or if they work, their impact is limited. I think it would make much more sense if a lot of the offset market could go towards financing passive house or actually energy positive retrofits, and that could be claimed in ESG reports or on perhaps be traded also on carbon markets. I think this would make a very big difference for this sector.
Yeah, and you had a really good point where you said we can't expect Herr and Frau Schmitz to pay for all of this, right? It has to be subsidized, because there's just, and I think that's kind of the common sense coming back to Germany too, is that sure, the government wants to push these measurements, they want to push heat pumps, but they only work if you really renovate your house almost to a passive house standard. But who can afford it, right? The person that's maybe, has 5 or 10 years left in their home, they're not going to do it, or they just can't afford it. So what are your suggestions to change that, to actually be a little bit more successful in these specific retrofit strategies?
I absolutely think that we need public funding for this, and we need subsidies for this. If we think about that, because we would say, oh, there is no money. Well, there is a lot of money. Presently, well, not presently, but the last time we wrote our report, the last IPCC report, then we found that 6.5% of global gross domestic product, 6.5% of all of the production of the world goes to subsidize fossil fuels. When we know instead of subsidies should pay a big carbon price, that translates into well over $100 per ton of carbon dioxide emitted, instead of them paying more than $100 per ton of carbon dioxide emitted. So there is money. We should just redirect that kind of money for the right purpose, to subsidize passive house related retrofits. Of course, it's absolutely not easy, and it's not even if we consider, the oil industry is the evil and so on. It's much more complex than that, because no government wants to destroy a strong industry that is one of the biggest taxpayers, one of the biggest employers, that gives good pension benefits, and that is an important pillar of the whole establishment and government and stability of the country. So these are not easy reforms. I fully recognize, and it's not helpful to simply demonize either the oil industry or governments who are not easily making these steps forward. But I think it is important to be cognizant that currently a lot of money is going into the wrong direction, and in fact fossil fuel subsidies are surging. The International Monetary Fund reported that they are increasing almost exponentially, or they are increasing very significantly. So it is very important that we are becoming more and more aware that there is money, but it is going to the wrong place, and it is in the end not benefiting our societies. And perhaps it is society that in the end will have to press for, or will have to work with the policymakers to demand that slowly this is changing for the right direction.
Yeah. And you would think something like a passive house standard or a certification as a tool should be fairly easy for a government to require. So there's already, the tools are already there, right? The technology is there. You're saying the money is there. So we really have to work together to make it happen.
Exactly.
So another question, although you're saying that passive house is the 42, and it plays such a central part in all of what we're talking about, you did talk about some other strategies that need to be implemented to make it all work. Basically stepping back and looking at everything a little bit more holistically. Can you talk about those strategies?
Absolutely, because I think in this climate crisis, but it's not only climate crisis, biodiversity crisis, it's actually chemical pollution crisis, it's microplastic pollution crisis, and above all the other crises, which is either financial crisis or the wars raging around the world and so on. So we are in the era of crisis. To me, unsurprisingly, based on the Limits to Growth book, which already projected that in 2020s we are entering this era. But in this crisis, we can no longer just work in our bubbles. So even architects must collaborate with at least the more immediate colleagues or the more immediate professions that are influencing buildings. For example, passive house retrofit or a good energy positive retrofit can only happen if we really work on reducing energy demand, not only in heating and cooling, but other areas of energy demand in buildings. So that means the architect no longer focus only on the building shell and heating and cooling system, but also other, which is already originally the passive house concept, but perhaps getting more active in this collaboration. The other point is that I don't think we will be able to really meet stringent or ambitious standards in keeping cooling energy demands surging without also working with strongly, not only with urban heat islands, but also actually with shading, external shading. Every building that has windows or walls, but of course mainly the windows have the heat gains, but also walls that are insulated, that receive sunshine in strong in hours when the solar energy is very intensively coming in, should have trees that shade these walls or windows. Of course, it's not always possible. So there we need to have artificial shading. Nevertheless, we need to plant the trees today, which will shade more and more windows in 20 years when the really bad heat waves are coming and when we want to keep the populations cool without a lot of air conditioning, because again we said the air conditioner is actually just exacerbating the heat islands. So in addition, green infrastructure integrated in the urban fabric and even into the buildings as much as we can is important also for capturing carbon. Today, just urban trees, and actually without the soil microbiomes that they support, already sequesters over 7 gigatons of carbon dioxide. So that means that the more green infrastructure we integrate into the buildings and the immediate vicinity of buildings, the more carbon we capture, which is becoming tremendously important. And a lot of this we just start to understand is actually through the soil microbiome. So we have to keep the soils alive. So we need to design buildings and we have to construct them without disturbing as little of the soil as we possibly can and keep it alive. We cannot generate soil. We cannot manufacture soil. We can only transport somewhere else, but we need soil everywhere, healthy soil everywhere, also in cities. And finally, I think it's really important to think about the materials. First of all, to minimize not only energy demand, but also minimize material demands. Since material is also energy, but not only energy, it's also any material will result in pollution. Yes, bio-based materials are significantly better, so that's a very important substitute, but still even for bio-based materials to manufacture that will inevitably comes with pollution, and also we just cannot replace all human material needs by bio-based materials. So that's why we have to minimize material demand, but what we should replace by bio-based materials. That's for several reasons. First of all, to avoid pollution. Microplastic pollution is becoming so widespread that it's really in the past few years that we understood that now even a baby cannot be born totally virgin of microplastics, because already the placenta is fully loaded with microplastics, even through the breast milk. Now babies suck millions of microplastic particles with each bit of mother's milk that they are taking in. So, and this is really accelerating, and the amount is also, so we need to work with preventing a lot of synthetic materials use, and use also any material and any component as long as we possibly can. So beyond just not using as much synthetic materials, bio-based materials also have the further benefit of actually storing even temporarily carbon, and while they capture the carbon, and if we don't let them decay or be burned, then we take that amount of carbon out of the carbon cycle, even temporarily. But even that really helps us, because that buys us time for the other climate solutions. So the more bio-based materials we actually use within buildings, the more carbon actually we are storing within the buildings. So not also in the construction materials and installation, but furniture, it's increasingly plastic-based. But that's really very problematic, because in the end, plastic not only produces a lot of microplastic pollution and other pollution, but only in the end also gets either burned or decays, and then it also, the fossil-based carbon, then it gets released back into the atmosphere. So going back to natural materials is not only beautiful, but it's very important also from a climate and environmental perspective.
Yeah, and you're talking about using less. That basically affects the architecture as well, right? If you think about spaces a little bit differently and make spaces, or try not to make spaces that are not really being useful, you can reduce the amount of materials being used to build those buildings, but also the amount of cooling energy that is needed to cool or heat those buildings as well.
Exactly. Unfortunately, it's nice to have a lot of large space. It's beautiful and we feel good. Nevertheless, at this point with the different crises we are facing, we cannot afford to have a lot of space which are not useful. In fact, there is a lot of the demand or a lot of push from some research communities for sufficiency in the built environment, meaning that people should not have more than a certain amount of square footage per person. So we have to cap somehow the amount of infrastructure and built environment that we have, and that's also square footage, but also cubic footage. So it's also how much the space conditioned space per capita that we have, and also all of these buildings have also the building shell, which is also less if you have just the functional space. Of course, it's not about not having beauty and not about, we are not talking about closing people into caves, dark, cold caves at all. But there is a lot of architecture which can innovatively find nice intermediate solutions where you're not air conditioning giant, let's say, courtyards in vain when actually nobody is using that courtyard will not necessarily be more beautiful if it's covered by a glazed ceiling and so on. So there are many ways how we can still keep the aesthetics but not commit more materials and more energy use.
Yeah. Thank you so much. There's so many important messages that you're talking about or that you're conveying. The one thing that I remember when I read The Hitchhiker's Guide Through the Galaxy, like many years ago, is that there was a fish that translated, because they had to travel through the galaxy and talk to everyone, right? So there was a translation fish in everyone's ear. Do I remember that correctly?
Yes,
I don't know what it's called.
Yes.
But let's try and be the fish and spread the message here.
It's a nice metaphor.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for all the listeners to take their time.